You see that?
Yep.
Okay, so this should look somewhat familiar. It's got the sort of boilerplate intro that we typically have on all of our charters, sort of highlighting strategic plan, vision, mission, goals. And just wanted to call out some things that I've highlighted in blue lettering around purpose and scope. That includes oversight and recommendations on physical matters of the board, its budget, and the bucket of money we have in strategic innovation grants. Also will include guidance and recommendations on what I just said Julia is going to speak to in a bit here, including we owe to Title I funds, these general funds, including P10K under Future Ready, and other associated grant funding. In terms of the fiscal matters of the WTDB, there'll be a focus on budget development. Clay and I and Julia have been working on this board budget and spending plan. So you'll see that in future meetings. There'll also be a budgetary monitoring component and then recommendations related to the budget that go to the WTDB or the exec and maybe other committees depending on relevancy as we sort of dig into this and move forward. We'll assist in this budget committee Julia and her portfolio in the Office of Workforce Investments through review and analysis of projections, history, anticipated forecasted revenue, and then make recommendations on biennial budgets and spending plans. I'm not going to read all of these and bore you to death, but there is outlined in the charter other call outs in terms of responsibilities and the roles that you'll all play around, being collaborative, monitoring the budget, and reviewing and making recommendations on a regular basis. I also wanted to highlight authority authorized to seek information and support from relevant departments, engage external financial fiscal consultants if needed, and of course, interact with other members and committees. And last, just to make sure that we know what we're driving to, there's 3 key milestones: quarterly progress reports that'll be due at the quarterly board meetings or others. Again, we, as many of you already know, if not all of you, we're trying to sort of shift what we do at the quarterly board meetings, provide space for engaging and interesting speakers on relevant topics, and kind of get away from those committee and task force updates and move those into executive committee. So I think there'll probably be a mix of this reporting out between the full board if needed, or if any action items are necessary in the executive committee. There may be additional reports and items that will be due as demand dictates. And then the biennial board budget and spending plan will be due by the second quarter of the biennium. So that's all I've got. So I'll stop sharing and ask if there are any questions. Looks like Heather has one.
Look at me raising my hand. So I just have a clarifying question. If this is the WTDB's budget committee, will we be seeing all partners then, or are we just focused on WIOA Title I and the general funds that local boards get? Because it kind of seems like that's the only focus.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and one that Julia and I have talked about back upstream. I'll go ahead and answer as best I can, Heather, and then I'm sure Julia might. Well, I'm not sure, but she might have something that she'd like to say as well. I think our plan is to start and focus on what I just said around WTDB and in particular Title I. That said, given the role of the WTDB, it does make sense to think about the other titles. And so as things evolve and interest may hopefully grow amongst the other titles, we would really love for them to be a part of this. But right out of the gate, to try and dictate that, I think we didn't feel nor think super comfortable about that. But yeah, it is on the radar, and I think a strong hope for uh, myself as staff. And I don't mean to speak for Julia, but I think that's on her
Sure.
radar as well.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Our thinking is really to start off with things that we actually have control and authority over.
And purview over, yep.
And then, once this committee is like really up and running and being active in that, hoping to expand to other partners as well, for sure.
That would be great. I mean, at minimum, I'm thinking about Oregon Employment Department because their resources eclipse our resources by tens of millions. And so I think it's just important to look at the family checkbook.
So can I pipe in? I think that, to me, the local workforce boards are key, because they end up touching all those other ones. And so when I was trying to review the local plans, there's a lot of data and there's a lot of stuff, but it wasn't connecting all the dots in terms of, this is the career ladder. This is where this organization fits on the career ladder. This is why we're funding them. This is what happened last year. We're going to fund them again this year, and then also tie it to the population that the organization. So there wasn't a clear connect. And then the other thing too was that we also have these other large pools of money that other state organizations and fund the same organizations that we fund. So, but at the end of the day, all the people that come before the workforce board, the local workforce board, that funding, it would be ideal if they attach I think their 1090s, their form that says where they got their money from the last year. And so that then we can start seeing, this is the money that we're distributing to these organizations, but these are also the other pools of money that they're getting. And the education department and the employment department, well, we'll start with the employment department. It is key because they're the ones because this is all about workforce development. So the employment department is key. So we had talked about this earlier about, like, with tracking the funding of Future Ready. And I made the point, why isn't it a requirement that everyone that gets money from that is already in the Department of the Employment Department's database? Why aren't they already in there, so that all the money that they get gets attached to their records, so you can see where they end up getting a job or not getting a job? And so you can then start tracking, okay, how efficient are we in reaching our priority population, and what's our conversion rate of success? So by focusing on the information that the local workforce boards are collecting or have to take into consideration when they make their decision about how the money is going to be allocated to their plan, that pulls these other agencies, or these other, whatever you guys call them, you guys have all these titles, that pulls all the rest of it. So if we just look at the local workforce boards and the money that they're allocating and the population they're allocating to, and then they have to work with WorkSource, they have to work with all these different, so that's all in their purview. So we need to.
Well, we don't have that information though, Steve. I don't get any information from Oregon Employment Department about their money or their performance. Has anybody here seen their performance? I mean, that's kind of my point, is it's a big number, and they have more staff working in the centers than any of us.
Well, I went back and quickly reviewed, what is it called? Yeah, the report
Governance assessment.
Yeah, the government assessment report. Okay.
Yeah. In the
And then
appendix.
in there, here's all the themes. WorkSource Oregon is not well defined or understood by stakeholders. The role and impact of WorkSource Oregon compared to the state's broader work for education and economic development priority is not generally viewed by state leaders as critical drivers. Without a clear long-term vision from WorkSource, system-wide success measurements cannot be served. WorkSource Oregon lacks a clear system decision-making. They talk about the silos. So, I mean, they have to be included. They are the key hub, and then everything is just built upon somehow feeding that hub, and
Yeah,
it's not working.
And my hope is that, and I think everyone's hope is that the new data system, the modernization, whenever it finally actually happens, is gonna give us more insight, I think is the hope. I'm assuming that's the hope, right? So that hopefully we can even all be in one system, right? So you can see how many investments happen in a person. I mean, that's the ideal state, I think, right? Because then I think we'll have more data.
Well, and the other thing too, and this is what I'm going to speak at the workforce at the talent summit, is back when they launched Future Ready, and then we had an opportunity to meet with the keynote speaker, and they asked what our takeaways was. Well, one of the big takeaways was everyone recognized the system was broken, okay, and that we needed to fix this system, and we needed data and clarity, and that industry had to lead. Well, once again, when you look at how this thing is set up, it's not setting up with industry leading. To me, the first step is industry. They have to come to us with their data, because the data that I'm trying to sort through is just so vast that you can't get your brain wrapped around it to make sense to it. It's actionable. What we need to hear from the industry is these are our workforce needs over the next 5 to 10 years. These are the specific job roles that are important to us that need to be prioritized. And this is what the ideal worker looks like for that. And then here's our career ladders from first grade to owning your own company. Now, from that, now we can start looking at all the state resources, all the federal resources, attaching that to their career ladders, and then understanding, that population needs, particularly minority population, and where we do have resources and we do have gaps, we can now start doing it instead of us trying to understand the workforce system, the way it's set up in all its silos. Industry has to come forward first and start giving us numbers, because if we're going to engage them, it has to be based upon their numbers. That then, how do we integrate their systems in with the state system?
That's really good, Steve. And I think in addition to what Heather's shared there with her sector partnership work and other good sector partnership work that's happening at the local level across the state, I think, there's already great examples that we'll sort of hear the latest and greatest on at the Talent Summit, as a matter of fact, with the Clean Energy Workforce Coalition that PGE is leading, with the Future Ready consortia that are in full swing in manufacturing, technology, and healthcare. So I think, yeah, well said. I think that is spot on. I also wanted to make space. It looked like Ken was going to say something. Ken, I wasn't sure if you were going to be here. Welcome back from your European vacation.
Yeah, I apologize for joining late. I had flight delays and I got in late. So I'm mentally about 10% here, but I did, when I heard Steve's comments and sector strategies, that's something we did under Governor Kitzhaber, not so much under Governor Brown, which was really helpful to understand what the employers really truly needed us to focus on. And so I mean, this is just my personal opinion. I think we need to go back to the sector strategy approach and focusing on what employers truly need, just like you said, Steve. The other thing about workforce or WorkSource is that last budget committee that I saw when I was on the board and this again under Governor Kitzhaber, those dollars were very transparent. You saw wherever all the money went. We had a a little bit more of a partnership between Workforce Oregon and the Workforce Board, in that there was a lot of, every meeting we had the director share what was going on in her department, where the dollar, obviously employers fund a tremendous amount of that money goes into WorkSource Oregon through unemployment insurance. And, having a little bit more transparency, it just makes the system so much clearer. It was a little bit, there was a lot of different flows of money into the community college workforce and development, I think was the name of the committee, which had nothing to do with community college. I don't know. It was just really a name that was given to it. And now the heck is where that money kind of flows through. So it's become less clearer, to at least to me, on how the dollars flow. And not that I really need to see it, but I think, from a taxpayer's perspective, it's good to have that clarity and transparency of where dollars are coming into and how they're going out. I think it's truly important when you start talking about unemployment and unemployment insurance and how the employment department as a whole functions. And I agree wholeheartedly with you. I think it's so convoluted and so difficult to understand that you don't know if dollars are truly spent the way employers would like it to be spent, the way employees would like it to be spent, and just having a little bit more clarity. And I'm assuming it's working, but if it's working, show it.
Well, I got a data point that I'm going to share, and I'm not going to share a lot of data because I don't have enough time when I leave the panel. But this data point that jumped out from study that Work System did research, it says as of 2023, there are 1 million job openings in Oregon, and that number is going to get worse. So we can't sit back and wait for people to walk through the door at WorkSource or walk in. We're going to have to go out and engage and compete for the workers that are out there. So we have these huge macro issues, so that we do need transparency, because we do need workers, and we do need to know how many workers are we creating on a year-over-year basis to start closing that gap. So yes, there has to be transparency throughout the whole system so that we can track it and see how we are in closing that huge gap, which I think is going to be nearly impossible, but you got to move forward on it.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. Julia, it looks like you've got a question.
Yeah, I'm going to chime in here. Great conversation. And I really think that we need to refocus on the purpose of this committee right now. There's some pretty specific things that I'm hoping the committee will do sooner rather than later. And so I want to make sure we get to the actual budget information. We got a lot of in the weeds learning to do in order to be an effective committee. So yeah, just hoping we can refocus the conversation.
All right,
So
what are
should we
those
move into
things?
your presentation, Julia?
Yeah, that'd be great, unless anybody has more questions on the charter.
Looks like you're good.
I'm going to share my screen. Oh boy. Okay. I can't see you at all.
We see your
Julia, do you want me to
presentation.
I can pull it up on my screen. Would that be helpful?
Let me just see if I can figure out how to. Okay. What can you all see right now?
Now we're looking at ourselves in front
Okay.
of your presentation.
Okay. Well, just holler if you want me to stop. All right.
Okay, now we see your presentation.
That works.
Perfect. All right. Okay. So today we're really going to focus on WIOA Title I funding. We're going to get a little in the weeds, but first I'll start with sort of orienting us in the broader workforce system, kind of like
Hey,
what
Julia.
we were just, yep.
Just so you know, what we're seeing is the slide that you're talking to, and then the next slide with your talking points below.
So it's hard to see the slide you want us to look
Hey,
at? 'Cause
Julia,
it's
I'll
small.
just share it for you. Just give me 1 second to get it up, okay?
Okay. I'll start talking. Oh, thanks, Sydney. So this is the entire workforce system. This is the best graphic that we have that captures the entire workforce system. You'll see in the center is Oregon's public workforce system, which we call WorkSource Oregon. And then next slide, Sydney. So this is just a zoom in of WorkSource Oregon. Today, we'll really be focusing on under Higher Education Coordinating Commission, the Adult Dislocated Worker and Youth Workforce Development Services, which are the 3 WIOA Title I-B programs that the Office of Workforce Investments administers. Go to the next slide, and since we already talked about the charter, I'll skip over that one. And we can start digging into the mechanics of WIOA Title I-B funding. So each year, HEC receives a grant from the Department of Labor for the 3 WIOA Title I-B programs, Adult, Youth, and Dislocated Worker. And each grant has a 3-year allowable cost period. So we always have 3 different grant years running at the same time. Sometimes we even have 4 for a couple of months. Debbie Welter in our office does a fantastic job of managing all the funding. Most of the funds that we receive, we then grant out to the 9 local workforce boards via a formula that is largely dictated by the Department of Labor, but there is some flexibility. This formula is one of the areas I'd really like this committee to focus on first. And then for each grant year and for each program, we are allowed at the state to hold back up to a certain percentage. I'll get more into that in a little bit. Next slide, Sydney. So as I mentioned, the funding formulas are largely dictated by DOL, but there is some flexibility. For the youth and adult programs, the standard formula, and this is the one that Oregon has traditionally used, bases funding 1/3 of the funding on areas of substantial unemployment. And that means an area that is a contiguous geographic area within a state with an unemployment rate of at least 6.5% and a population of at least 10,000.
Julia, when you say there's some flexibility, is that flexibility given to just the governor, or does this board have some oversight or suggestions on that flexibility?
In statute, it is the governor, but we interpret that to be the WTDB.
Okay.
So this is something that the WTDB really does have.
So in process, if this committee made a recommendation to the board and the board voted in favor, then we can in essence take that recommendation to the governor for final approval, correct?
I believe it's in the state plan, but Clay, chime in. I think you're gonna say that.
Yeah, I was just gonna add really quickly. Julia's right, but I wanted to clarify one thing, and that is that the board sets the policy, which establishes the formula.
Yeah.
So the policy has to be consistent with WIOA. So again, it's going to reflect the things that are required of us, but where we have flexibility, it will be in our WTDB's policy that that will then be implemented. So just a clarification.
Okay, I appreciate it. Thanks, Julia.
Yeah. On the areas of substantial unemployment, for context, last year, none of the areas in Oregon had areas of substantial unemployment. So that wasn't actually a factor in it. If like one local board area does have this factor, it obviously provides a huge amount of funding to that one local area.
But Julia, just to be clear, that area would have to have 10,000 people in it?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
And then the second third is based on excess unemployment, which is the number of unemployed in a local area in excess of 4.5% of the labor force. And then the remaining third is based on the number of disadvantaged youth or adults, depending on whether we're talking about youth or adults. So that's the number at or below the poverty line. And then, so again, that's the standard formula. That's what Oregon has used traditionally. The discretionary formula, where we have some flexibility, but still not a lot, 70% still has to be that standard formula, but the remaining 30% can be based on excess poverty and unemployment in urban, rural, and suburban local areas. And that basically means if there are local areas, if there are urban, rural, or suburban local areas where excess poverty is above the state average, we can provide more funding to those local areas. I don't know if we've ever done that, but we have not included that in the formula in quite a while. And then the dislocated worker formula is a little more malleable. The statute says that the governor establishes this formula in a manner that addresses the state's dislocated worker needs, and must include information on this list of factors: insured unemployment data, unemployment concentrations, plan closings, etc. But it doesn't dictate percentages, doesn't say exactly what these data are, so there's a little bit more flexibility here. Any questions before I move to the next slide, which will talk about what Oregon currently does? Okay, next slide, Sydney. So here's what we currently do in Oregon. Again, the youth and adult formulas are just the standard formula. And then for the dislocated worker formula, we divided the funding evenly among those factors that were listed on the last slide, except we don't have any funding based on farmer and rancher economic hardship data because we don't have a reliable source of that data. So that's just not included in the formula. We also include a 90% hold harmless piece in the formula that's intended to reduce the funding volatility. So this ensures that no board drops below 90% of their average funding for the past 2 years. Sometimes the factors that go into these formula actually change a lot. And so a board could potentially lose, 20% of their funding, and then the next year gain 20% of the funding, and that up and down is really hard for the boards to manage. So this is just intended to sort of even it out a little bit more. And Heather can definitely speak to that because she's seen some of those swings.
Hey, Julia, could you talk a little bit more in detail on the 5 bullets next to the dislocated worker box?
I might have to come back and talk about those at another time. I was hoping Debbie's not on, right?
No.
I don't think so. I was assuming that she would be on and could talk.
No worries. So
more
we
to
can
these.
we can tee those up for next
Yeah.
time.
We'll follow.
Thank
I'll
you.
follow up on that. Yeah. Thanks, Todd. Okay, next slide, Sydney. So earlier I mentioned that the state is allowed to hold back a certain amount of funding for its own purposes, for administrative costs and statewide activities and rapid response. Here are the allowable holdbacks for each funding stream. So you'll see from each of the program, we can hold back up to 5% for administrative costs and up to 10% for statewide activities. And then from the dislocated worker funding, we can hold back 25% for rapid response activities. Next slide, Sydney. I'll talk about what those different uses are. So administrative costs are costs related to the administration of the federal grant award, like grant management, fiscal management, procurement, HR, IT, that sort of thing that are directly related to the management of the grant. And then statewide activities are pretty broad. I just listed a few broad categories here, but they include, initiatives around program and service delivery, innovation and coordination. It could include performance-based grant making, technical assistance. So my team provides a lot of technical assistance to the local boards on their grants. Support for the state board. So like Todd and Clay are funded largely by WIOA 10% funds, by statewide activity funds, research, and a variety of other things. But this is sort of like the state's fund to do innovative, creative things, or to do things that are really aligned with statewide priorities. And then the last piece is that 25% allowable holdback from the dislocated worker for rapid response activities. And these include layoff aversion activities, swift and coordinated response to a layoff and closure, which includes like coordination with the employer, labor, and then the provision of information and services to affected workers. Now we have sort of switched the model. So now we have designated the local boards to carry out rapid response activities. So most of what we hold back from the 25% actually ends up then going back out to the local boards to do this work. Any questions on the state holdbacks?
I'm just curious how the WARN Act or how the WARN employers that are going through compliance with the WARN Act, how are those, is that obviously that's going through like rapid response activities because you have a major change. Is that where those dollars usually fund through?
Yeah, exactly. So now we send most of the dollars out to the local boards, but we do keep some at the state to manage the WARN system and coordinate that work. And though these rapid response funds are exactly intended to help those workers affected through.
Is there a set dollar amount for that, or is it do you budget from year to year differently? I'm curious because when you have like a major industry shift like we did in the late 80s, early 90s from timber to IT or I guess the Silicon Valley growth. That would have, required a much larger retraining cost.
Yeah, typically we hold back. I believe we hold back most of our allowable holdback because then if we don't end up using it for rapid response activities, we can put it out to the boards. After 2 years, we can put it out to the boards for use on other things. So we do try to hold back as much as we can to make sure that we have enough to address any. And
so we have to apply for that from the state.
Not anymore.
Yay.
Although we will still hold back a small amount for kind of what you said, Ken, if there's something totally unforeseen or something much larger. But also if there's a very large event like the wildfires a couple years ago, then we can and did in that case apply for a national dislocated worker grant, which provides additional funds to respond to large dislocations like that. And that could potentially happen for not necessarily a natural disaster, but just like a large statewide layoff or a large layoff in a local area.
And is it fair to say, Julia, that these rapid response activities and funding, it's just a subset of dislocated worker?
Yes.
And I think one of the challenges that we experience is when we have a large layoff that doesn't necessarily necessitate a national emergency grant, we don't see the increase in funding until the following program year because they use data from the previous year to decide what our formula is as a state. So it's usually a year delay, basically.
Yeah. Yep. Any other questions? Okay, next slide. And so this is the process for when we get the funding amount from DOL, when we learn what that statewide amount is. My office creates multiple scenarios with different state holdback amounts. And then I review those with Debbie Welter, our budget person, and decide what we recommend the governor, which scenario we recommend that the governor selects. Send all those scenarios to the governor, marking the one that we recommend. And the governor's policy advisor determines the final state holdback amounts. And that in turn determines how much we then put out to the local boards. Of note, OE needs to notify the local boards of the final allocation amount within 40 days of OE receiving the DOL allocation notice. We actually just received yesterday the 2024 statewide allocation. And so that starts the process for this year. So next step will be for Debbie to create some scenarios for us to review them and make a recommendation to the governor and the governor's office to decide which scenario to go with. That's the end of the slides that Sydney has, but Sydney, if you want to stop sharing, I'm just going to share 2 more slides that I added just to give you a little sense. But first, Anne, I'll go to you.
Yeah, not for big discussion today, but just something for another day for us to talk about is when you think about all the investments being made out in Hillsborough, specifically with Intel, their $36 billion investment, and then all the adjacent organizations around them that will also benefit from their expansion. I wonder if there's an opportunity for us to play sort of a leadership role in there and saying, like, what are those jobs? Up front, there'll be construction jobs, obviously, but then sort of longer term, like, what are the jobs that are going to be needed? And I'm assuming that some of those jobs will be remote enabled. So it wouldn't be that you just had to be in Washington County or Multnomah County, that, you know, some of Heather's clients could benefit from that, you know, in terms of like, hey, here's some opportunities that we see coming. And then, you know, working through like making sure everybody knows what those are and that we're playing some sort of role to help so that when you do have a warrant in a certain part, you know, maybe there's an opportunity to connect them to all that work that's going on out there. I just would hate for us to miss that opportunity.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm privy to a certain amount of projects going on that I don't even think the state's privy to some degree, because employers don't naturally go there. They usually go out to the staffing companies to see where they can get. And I know, like on Amazon in the Boardman area, there's 6 very large projects right now that are understaffed substantially. And it's a lot to do with licensing and licensing restrictions from reciprocity from other states. Amazon, you know, wants help, but they don't really want to go to the government for help, because then it feels like they're getting sucked into you know, a process they don't want to. So it's an interesting conflict. Then there's also, you know, Google's doing a lot with carbon scrubbing and the credits that come with that process. And that's going to be expanding substantially in the state. And I don't know how much the state's aware of that process. These are just a few that I know of, and I can promise you there's a lot that are out there that I don't know about. But you know, the expansion out in Hillsborough, you're correct. There's no way that stuff can happen without some coordinated effort to bring trained people into the area. And again, a lot of those are licensed trades. So you just can't bring them in from everywhere. They have to have a reciprocity type agreement to do that.
Yeah, you know, so a couple of things. A lot of information, a lot of formulas. I understand this is the way that the system works, and I know it's going to take a long time to get everything aligned. But my question is, so in this whole process, so where is industry and where are the consortiums that were stood up for work for Future Ready? So where do they plug in to all this information and data to make sure that industry's needs are met?
Todd, do you want to make a comment first before try to address that?
Yeah, well, yeah.
You're muted.
You're muted, Todd.
Thanks. So I just wanted to flag something that I think many of you board members have heard me say in the past, but just for context and keep this in mind, you know, over the last, Heather, you probably know a little bit better than I, but I want to say 7-8 years, the funding that has come from the Department of Labor to the Office of Workforce Investment has been reduced by about 50%. I don't have the exact
Correct.
numbers, but it's just an important thing, I think, to note that, you know, let's use Heather's. I mean, Heather's region goes from the Columbia River to the, you know, California border, pretty much down the middle of the state. And the expectation is that she, as the executive director, and her staff are supposed to, you know, manage that on, I know it's not one for one, Heather, but a 50% reduction from 60 million to a little around 60 million to a little over 30 million that's coming into our office and then being distributed out by the complicated formulas that Julia just touched on. So I just wanted to provide a little context around what the actual funding, you know, total amount was.
So I really appreciate that, Todd, because I was going to bring that up. The state used to receive around 60 million about a dozen years ago, and now it's closer to 30 million. Although the Teagle looks like there's some increases in our funding in 2 of the
Yes.
streams, adult and
Yeah, I
youth,
saw
which
that.
is exciting.
20% overall increase in funding this year. First time in a very long time.
And it's unheard of. And what's really interesting, though, is a lot of this formula is based on population density, right? And so Portland is actually losing population for the first time, and my area is not. So when I started, our allocation was closer to 9% of the total pool, and now we're up to closer to 11, and hopefully we'll keep eking up because I could use the dough, let me tell you.
Yeah.
Well, I know every state, when I was part of the NGA, they that was a constant drumbeat of we need to increase these dollars. They keep going down and down and down. And I realize that the local workforce boards are scraping for dollars and looking for grants and other, but those are like one-time dollar projects.
Exactly, Ken.
That become a nightmare. And from a business perspective, it's not something that you want to have as a sustainable model. But I do understand that you have to find ways to fill the holes that are constantly coming down.
And part of the reason Oregon's has declined, not the whole reason, because funding overall just hasn't grown, but part of the reason is because Oregon's economy has been doing quite well. And so part of the reason we're getting more this year is because actually now we're not doing quite as well comparatively to the rest of the country, or to more of the rest of the country. So there's just that to keep in mind too, that sometimes increased funding actually means it's because, oh, we have more people that need to be served. But Steve, getting back to your question, as you saw, the mandated funding formulas don't really take into account, you know, business employer needs. They're really focused on these broad unemployment poverty factors. However, where we should be including employer engagement and employer needs is in the creation of the state plan and in the creation of local plans, which really dictate then how we at the state and the local areas spend their funding, where they allocate those dollars, what kind of training programs they allocate those dollars to. And then we do have some control in those statewide activities that we hold back at the state. That's where we can also make some more pointed investments in specific industries, in specific types of trainings. That's where we have a little bit more flexibility to do some of that work. And that's a big part of why we formed this budget committee and have industry representatives on it to help inform those priorities. And then I'll also say, you know, this is a piece of our funding, and it's a big piece of our funding, but we also get state funding in OE, and that also has more, we have more flexibility to target that funding to specific employer needs and industries. And that's, I think, where the industry consortia and the information that they're learning can also really inform state investments beyond just the Future Ready Oregon investments, but statewide investments in general.
Yeah, it would be nice. You know, I think what kind of happens, and this is just from my outside looking in perspective, is industry, what they start doing is like an Intel with a $38 billion investment. They set aside dollars to recruit and train and bring in a workforce. Those dollars never go through the state. They're private dollars that they're going to spend. If there was some type of partnership where they felt like they could send those dollars over to the state to say, okay, you help us because you have the staff, you have the resources, you have the training. That partnership makes more sense from that perspective. You got additional boots on the ground to help them. But what most companies do will really do it internal and don't involve the state on some of those. I know they set up these grants that you apply for, but there's no direct partnership one-to-one. And how we facilitate that, I think that's something our board could probably help to some degree. But there is they like to have control over those dollars. And I know when you hand it over to the state, you lose a little bit of that control. And so that's an issue that the state has to figure out. How do we assure the investors of private dollars, how those are going to be utilized so that they benefit the person who gives it to them.
And where that also runs into policies at the state level. So with construction, when Kate Brown gave her executive order for all the public agency to come up with a diversity program, they did that, and they came up with these aspirational goals for contractors to increase the number of minority contractors and firms on public works and minority workers, but they didn't allocate any money to it. Okay, so therefore, this Title I, I think it's Title I. You guys, the funds that we're talking about here are targeted towards priority populations, and that ideally that's priority populations to get them into the workforce. So if industry, and particularly minority associations and businesses, if they're not aware of the workforce board, then how is it workforce development for minorities or targeted population, priority populations? So the question then becomes, so what is our metric for success? How do we measure success and progress in achieving that? Is it worker count or is it formula count? So what is our measurement going to be for success?
So I'm wondering if you had 2 more slides, Julia, and I'm just curious what they are. And then also, I was hoping that this committee would also want to play a role in education and outreach or advocacy around refunding P10K, frankly, because with the cuts that we're experiencing and the great need, the folks that are coming in to the WorkSource centers are more expensive to serve. Paying for staffing is more expensive than it's ever been. And when we just keep getting this death by 1,000 cuts from WIOA, it's really hard to be effective and be relevant to the industries you're talking about when we barely can eke by to cover the front desk, right? How do we do that additional step without more money? Is just an advocacy point.
And Julia, one last thing, okay? Because I don't want to feel like I'm a negative guy, okay? What I want to see come out of this is I just want us to quantify what the current workforce system capacity is. Good, bad, ugly, it doesn't matter. We need to quantify what it is and how that contributes to achieving whatever goals that we then set. So we really do need to have a baseline understanding of what the system is and how it's operating right now and how effective it is. That's what I'm hoping it comes out of this, because we're having to work with less. And what I'm hearing from Heather, you have to work with less. So therefore, we have to be more and more efficient and targeted, that we get the results that we're looking for. And that, to me, a key part of that goes to what pools of the priority population are we focusing on to get our conversion of success. So I just want to be able to know, starting out, what is driving the current capacity, what it is, and what's driving it, and then how do we measure, progress as we track and advise.
So I'm struggling with how we would get to capacity, because I'm thinking about the fact that WorkSource is not a closed system. So the WIOA youth system is a closed system. Young people have to be eligible. There's enrollment capacity. Whereas the public workforce system, we don't get to decide, oh, you know what? We don't have any more capacity. You can't come in the center. So I think it's more about looking at how many people are served on an annual basis. And this isn't a Title I conversation. This is all partners. How many people are served? How much money is that really as a cost per, and is that reasonable? If it's 500 bucks a person, that's not reasonable, right?
Right. So yeah, you want that, but ultimately, since this is workforce development, the key metric is how many additional workers are we creating on a year-over-year basis because of our work. That, to me, is the key metric, given the gap in all the open jobs. So that, to me, is, that's all this work that we're doing.
I see. Mm-hmm.
At the end of the day, that's the number we need to know, because, like I said, on the construction side and the general contractors, public agencies are saying we want 30% of the workforce to be minority. Well, okay, right now we got this big gap. It's not there. So we got to build that capacity. So we need to allocate money and resources to build the minority capacity to meet your aspirational goals. Otherwise, don't try to use the procurement system as a stick and a hammer, and they'll be like, fine, we're the only ones who can do the job anyway. We're going to get it anyway. So we'll play your game, and that does not help minorities. So we have to be very clear, if we're really talking about building an equitable workforce, we just can't slap equity on every new project and say, equity lens, equity lens. It's like, hold up, there's only so many minorities, okay? This is the capacity that has to spread across all industries. So when I say capacity, that's what I'm talking about. This is the capacity of minorities to fill. These are the gaps that they have right now that's keeping them from accessing opportunities. This is the funding that's currently there. This is the funding that's needed. We need to know that, since this is our role here, coming from the federal government, is to really focus on the priority population. And we need to know who they are and whether or not we're meeting their specific needs, that then has to meet the business needs. Otherwise, they won't engage with us. So it does have to be a public-private partnership. And I hope that we can just, like I said, the goal, when I say capacity, it's not just one thing. It's just how many workers, minority workers, are we adding to the workforce on a year-over-year basis? To me, it's my key metric, and what industries. So.
Thanks, Steve. Hey, we only have about a minute left. Ann, did you have a question?
It's fine. I'm good. I was just going to talk about leading and lagging metrics. Move on.
Okay. Julia, any more that you wanted to share?
No, my 2 slides were just to show an example of the scenarios that we send, and to show the funding that we just received and the increase, but I talked about that. Overall, 20% increase in funding this year.
To add a little bit of clarity, I get where Steve's coming from with employers having this need and where they're going to get the employers from. And there's a lot of employees that never touch this system. Employers are going to be able to reach and grab and bring in. What the system really, and this is a part I had a time grappling with, is the system is really to help the people that are unemployable or have difficulty finding work, or say, and helping them up, raising them up into positions. And so there's this conflict of, are we doing the training to bring people that are unskilled into the current positions. But then, you know, that this system is really there to target those struggling populations that are unemployed or maybe even unemployable, and somehow bringing them into the workforce, where the employers are looking at, okay, I need some of those, but there's a large group out there that are trainable, that are good employees that never even touch the system completely. How do we increase that number? And that's where the challenges always lie, because the state workforce system is really to take people that are struggling to find positions or find work and train them into those positions.
Thanks for that, Ken. We're about a minute past. We've got some great notes that we'll make sure we incorporate into the next meeting we have. And I think our plan moving forward is to now sort of take each of those buckets of funding, the adult, the dislocated worker, the youth, either separately or just in smaller chunks, and take a deeper dive in subsequent meetings. And, you know, we'll probably come in with a review of what Julia has shared with you today. It takes a while, as you said earlier, Steve, to wrap your head around it. I would encourage you all also to go back to the governance assessment that you can find on the WTDB website under data and reports, and go to the appendix. I think it's 3. That shows you all of the different buckets of money, just to sort of not only remember how complex it is, but also to look at all the different funding streams that comprise the public workforce system. And then I think we've got meetings scheduled out for several months now, so they should be on your calendar. And thank you so much. It was a great discussion. Thanks for being here today. And we look forward to continuing the conversation at our next meeting. Please let me know if you have any questions, need information. Happy to help.
In the future, will this body be weighing in on the different formulas? Because you only have 45 days to do that, and we're not meeting in the next 45 days.
We're not, it's not going to be. For
We're not
this.
there yet.
It'll be the
We're
next
not
year.
there yet.
Yeah.
No problem. Sounds good. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you at the summit.